a quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in. Let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. In tonight's quiet archive, we will trace the long, patient life of a single idea, a lost city said to have shone beyond the western edge of the known world, then vanished in one night of water and fire. We will begin where the record is clearest, in Plato's dialogues, and then move outward into maps, myths, earthquakes, sea level change, and the slow work of archaeology. We will listen to what the ancient sources do and do not say, and we will examine the theories that have gathered around the name across centuries, from Santorini to the Atlantic, from metaphor to misreading. By the end, the city may still be unseen, but the story of why it endures will be quietly, carefully preserved. This is Atlantis, Chapter 1, the first mention in the archive. There are stories that arrive to us like wind, ungraspable, shifting, always changing shape. And then there are stories that arrive like paper, with edges, with names, with a place in a shelf. Atlantis belongs to the second kind, at least at first. If we open the archive with care, we can point to a specific doorway, a pair of texts that survive from ancient Greece, and a single author whose voice is still preserved in ink and translation. Plato. Not the Plato of marble statues and classroom summaries, but the Plato of living conversation, of arguments and doubts, of a mind trying to build a model of a good society by imagining one. Atlantis appears primarily in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. In the first, it is introduced with a deliberate seriousness, almost like a librarian announcing a document. A story, we are told, that is not a myth, but a true account. A story carried from Egypt to Greece, from a priest to a lawgiver, from Solon to his family, and then down through generations until it reaches Critias, who tells it to Socrates. Already, you can feel the careful framing, a chain of custody. It is a technique as old as storytelling itself. If you cannot show the original, you show the lineage. You show the fingerprints. You show the witnesses. In Plato's account, Solon travels to Egypt, to the city of Sais. There, a priest tells him that the Greeks are like children, always forgetting, always losing the older records when catastrophe wipes the slate clean. Floods, fires. The world resets and memory becomes young again. The priest claims Egypt keeps older archives, stone and papyrus that survive when other lands are washed clean. And within those records is the tale of a great conflict between ancient Athens and a powerful island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles. The pillars, the strait we now call Gibraltar, the Western Gate. In Plato's telling, Atlantis is not merely an island, but the center of a wider dominion, an empire that we can add one more quiet archival note. Plato is writing in the 4th century BCE, long after the era of the Mycenaean palaces, and long after the Bronze Age collapse. He is writing in a world where Athens has tasted imperial power and then suffered defeat. The Peloponnesian War is not a distant rumor. It is still in living memory. When a society has experienced sudden reversal, it becomes psychologically ready to hear stories of sudden reversal. A city that thinks itself unshakable begins to imagine shaking. So, how do classicists read the claim that the Atlantis account is not a myth? Some treat it as a playful insistence, a signal that we are meant to take the philosophical lesson seriously. Others treat it as Plato experimenting with a genre that looks like historiography. a cousin to the stories Herodotus tells when he reports Egyptian and Persian accounts he cannot fully verify. And some note that even if Plato invented Atlantis, he invented it with the vocabulary of real states: tribute, naval power, alliances, laws, land division, and the administrative language of an empire. There is also the matter of the unfinished ending. Critias breaks off, and no ancient continuation survives. Some scholars think Plato simply did not complete the dialogue. Others think the ending was lost. Either way, the fragmentary nature becomes part of the myth. The story of a lost city is itself partly lost. In later centuries, that incompleteness has been treated as an invitation. Readers step in to fill what is missing. Novelists do it openly. Speculators do it while insisting they are recovering what must have been. In archival terms, we can label that impulse as reconstruction. Reconstruction is not always dishonest. It is sometimes necessary. But in historical work, reconstruction is constrained by evidence and by comparison to parallel material. In Atlantis studies, reconstruction often becomes unbounded. The missing ending becomes a blank check. The careful archivist keeps the tear visible, and finally, we return to the number. 9,000 years is not just a number. It is a distance that separates the listener from the possibility of direct verification. It is an ancient way of saying, beyond living memory, beyond the reach of ordinary testimony. In modern debates, that distance has become a battleground. Some argue scribal error, some argue unit conversion, some argue deliberate exaggeration. The documentary posture is to note calmly that the text gives us the number we have, and that any change to it must be acknowledged as a change. So chapter 1 closes with a simple, grounded statement. Our primary archive is literature, and the first task is to read it with the same seriousness we bring to a map or an artifact. The story begins as ink. Everything else grows outward from there. Chapter 2, Rings of Water, Rings of Meaning. To understand why Atlantis has lasted, we must linger over its description. Not the question of where it was, but the question of how it is built in the mind. Plato's Atlantis is not described as a random city. It is described as a system, a designed environment. It has geometry. It has symmetry. It has layers, like an onion, or like a record, where each ring is a groove holding sound. The concentric canals are perhaps the most iconic detail. When later centuries imagine Atlantis, they almost always imagine circles. They imagine a central temple. They imagine a harbour. They imagine bridges crossing water like veins. This is not an accident. A circle is a powerful symbol. It suggests completeness. It suggests order. It suggests the cosmos. In Greek thought, circles and spheres are associated with perfection. Plato himself loved geometry. In many tellings, the entrance to his academy bore an instruction that those ignorant of geometry should not enter. Whether or not that inscription is historically true, the association is appropriate. Atlantis is geometric. It is a city that could be drawn. And when a city can be drawn, it can be searched for. It can be argued for. It can be placed onto a map by imagination. The city is also described as wealthy beyond measure. It has fertile plains. It has hot and cold springs. It has forests. It has elephants. It has metal mines. It has stone quarries. It has ships. It has disciplined armies. And it has rituals. A striking scene where the kings of Atlantis gather and hunt bulls, capturing them without weapons, and then performing sacrifices and oaths. The kings inscribe laws on a pillar of orichalcum, They swear to judge fairly. They swear to avoid internal war. It sounds like a constitutional ritual, a ceremonial reinforcement of governance, but it is also a signal. Atlantis begins with order, and then slips. Over time, Plato says, the divine portion of their nature fades, and the human portion grows. They become greedy, they become arrogant, they expand, they attempt to conquer, and then the fall. Earthquakes, floods, one day and one night. The island sinks. The sea becomes impassable with mud. This final detail, the mud, is like a small, quiet hook. Mud suggests shallow water. Mud suggests a drowned landscape, not an abyss. It suggests that ships could not pass because the sea was choked with debris. It reads like an eyewitness attempt to explain a navigational hazard. And yet, it also reads like a moral consequence, the sea itself becoming clogged by the remains of excess. Now in the archive, we must be careful. We should not treat the symbolic as proof of the literal, but we also should not assume that symbolism means there is no literal seed. Human beings do not invent disasters out of nowhere. We experience them, we remember them, we tell stories about them, and then we shape those stories to fit our values. Consider the most common pattern in flood myths: a world that becomes corrupt, a punishment of water, a remnant that survives, a rebirth. Atlantis is a flood myth, wearing a crown and carrying a ledger. It is a catastrophe narrative with urban planning. This dual nature makes it adaptable. If you want Atlantis to be moral allegory, you can focus on the decay and punishment. If you want Atlantis to be history, you can focus on the architectural details and the chain of custody. If you want Atlantis to be prophecy, you can focus on the suddenness and the warning. If you want Atlantis to be psychology, you can focus on the dream of a perfect city and the fear of its loss. One story, many doors. This is why, even in antiquity, Plato's Atlantis did not remain isolated. Other writers referenced it. Some treated it skeptically. Some treated it as plausible. Later, as the classical world shifted into new empires and new religions, the name persisted, like a stamp on a sealed envelope. And then, centuries later, when the world began to draw global maps, Atlantis found a new habitat. The empty spaces, the unknown oceans, the edge of the chart. When explorers sailed west, imagination sailed with them. A lost island empire beyond the pillars of Heracles. It suddenly felt geographically possible. Even if Plato's story was a philosophical device, the age of exploration transformed it into a geographical temptation. In the archive, we note a second rule: stories migrate. When the world changes, stories find new containers. Atlantis began as a story inside a dialogue. Then it became a story inside a map. Then it became a story inside an ideology. And later, it became a story inside entertainment. But before it became a blockbuster, before it became a comic book, before it became a shorthand for a lost advanced civilization, it passed through quieter hands. Scholars, clerics, cartographers, and especially translators. Because translation is not merely a change of language, it is a change of world. The Renaissance rediscovered Plato. Humanists copied and printed the texts. Atlantis returned to circulation with new intensity, and with printing, the story gained replication. Not one manuscript in one library, but hundreds, then thousands. The idea began to multiply, and when ideas multiply, they mutate. Small changes, different emphases, different footnotes, different assumptions. Soon, Atlantis could be placed anywhere a reader wanted. In the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, under Antarctica, in the Sahara, in the mind, So now, in the hush of the archive, we look at the rings of water again. They are literal rings, but they are also rings of meaning. Each era adds a new ring. Each ring holds a new interpretation. And at the center, always, is the same quiet pulse. A city, a loss, a warning. To deepen the documentary lens, we can compare Atlantis to a related family of narratives. The ideal city, the cautionary city, and the vanished city. Plato is not writing in a vacuum. Greek literature contains stories of glorious places that fail. Hesiod speaks of ages of humanity that decline. Poets speak of hubris that calls down punishment. Plato folds those familiar moral arcs into a city plan you can measure. That measurability is important. A city described with dimensions feels like a report. The plain is given a size, the canals have widths, the central island has proportions. Even if the numbers are stylized, their presence changes the reading experience. The listener is not drifting in metaphor alone. The listener is counting, and counting creates a different kind of belief. A reader may distrust a vague paradise, but a reader may trust a paradise with engineering. We can also pay attention to what the design communicates about power. Concentric rings create controlled access. Bridges can be guarded. Water can be a moat. A central sanctuary can be protected by layers of infrastructure. In a modern documentary about fortifications, we would note that such designs appear in different cultures for different reasons. Defense, ritual separation, symbolic hierarchy. Plato's rings do all three. They defend, they separate, they signal that the center is sacred. Then there is the detail of elephant life. In ancient Greek imagination, elephants are not household animals. They are signs of distance and exotic abundance. The mention hints at a far rich landscape, a place that has resources the ordinary Greek polis lacks. But the mention is also ambiguous. Elephants existed in North Africa in antiquity, and ancient writers spoke of them. So the elephant detail does not force Atlantis into a fantasy realm. It can also be read as a marker of a broad, empire-scale territory. Orichalcum is another example of how a single word can generate centuries of commentary. In some ancient contexts, the term refers to a valued metal, perhaps a copper alloy with a bright sheen. In later retellings, it becomes almost magical. Modern audiences, raised on science fiction, may hear unknown metal and immediately imagine technology beyond the period. But in an archaeological documentary, we would remind ourselves that ancient people did experiment with alloys, that rare materials were traded and prized, and that language for precious often becomes language for mysterious. And then we return to the pillar of laws. The scene of kings gathering, sacrificing, and swearing oaths is staged like an ethnographic vignette. Plato invites us to see a political culture from the inside. He shows ritual as a mechanism that binds rulers to rules. In real societies, this is common. Coronations, oaths on sacred objects, public ceremonies that make authority visible and therefore accountable. Plato uses the scene as a hinge. When the oath is honored, Atlantis is stable. When the oath becomes mere theater, Atlantis is already falling. The narrative thus functions as a diagram of decline, a structure built on restraint, slowly hollowed out by appetite. The rings become a metaphor for layers of protection that fail once the core is corrupted. It is not only that the sea breaches the city, it is that the city breaches itself. That is why the mud line matters as more than a geological hint. Mud is the result of disturbance. It is the churned remains of a stable landscape. It is the opposite of clear water and clean channels. If you think of Atlantis as a mind, the mud is confusion. If you think of Atlantis as an empire, the mud is the debris of collapse. And if you think of Atlantis as a physical place, the mud is what actually happens when land slides into sea. When cartographers later drew Atlantis, they often drew circles, but they also drew an absence, a labeled blank. That blank is a kind of ring too. It is a ring of not yet known. It invites an explorer to step in. It invites a reader to imagine that the map is incomplete and that completing it will complete the self. So chapter 2 closes with a gentle recognition. Atlantis persists not only because it is a story of destruction, but because it is a story with a shape. A shape can be held. A shape can be drawn. A shape can be searched for. The rings of water become rings of attention. Chapter 3. The Mediterranean Hypothesis. If we must move from the library to the sea, the first waters we touch are not the Atlantic. They are closer. They are the waters between lands that were once connected by trade, by war, by language. The Mediterranean. Many serious attempts to connect Atlantis to a real event begin here. Not because the name demands it, but because the region offers the most plausible mixture of ancient literacy, complex societies, and geological catastrophe. One candidate has become especially famous: Thera, Santorini, a volcanic island in the Aegean Sea. If you have ever seen images of it, you may remember the crescent shape, the caldera, the sea filling a wound left by an explosion. In the Bronze Age, around the 2nd millennium BCE, Thera experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. Ash fell across the region. Tsunamis likely struck nearby coasts. The atmosphere may have dimmed. Crops may have failed. And the great maritime culture of the time, the Minoans of Crete, may have been weakened. This is where the Atlantis theory begins to feel tangible. A powerful island culture, a sudden disaster, a sea empire. The Minoans were indeed skilled sailors. They traded widely. They built palaces with complex layouts. They painted frescoes of dolphins and lilies. They lived with the sea as a daily companion, and their world did suffer disruptions. So some have suggested, perhaps Plato's Atlantis is a memory of a Bronze Age catastrophe, filtered through centuries, translated into Greek, amplified into a moral parable. This is not a foolish idea. It is, in fact, one of the few that tries to bridge literature and geology with minimal fantasy. But it still has problems. The time scale is off. Plato says 9,000 years. Thera is around 3,500 years before us. You can try to fix this by arguing a mistranslation of Egyptian numbers. You can argue that the priest meant 900, or that the units were different. And sometimes, in the archive, we see how tempting it is to adjust numbers. But a careful archivist marks this as an intervention. It is not in the text. It is an attempt to rescue the theory. Another challenge is geography. Plato places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Heracles. Santorini is deep inside the Aegean. To resolve this, some argue the pillars were not Gibraltar, but another gateway. Others argue that Plato used the phrase loosely. Again, possible. But again, it is adjustment. Still, the Mediterranean hypothesis remains valuable, even if it is not definitive, because it forces us to pay attention to something that is unquestionably real. The ancient world was not stable. Earthquakes were common. Coastlines changed. Ports silted up. Islands rose and sank. A city could be lost without needing a magical continent. In Greece itself, there are submerged ruins. In the eastern Mediterranean, there are drowned harbors. In the Black Sea region, there are debates about rapid flooding events. And along the coasts, there are layers of sediment that mark moments when the sea came in. The sea is an archivist too. It keeps records, but it keeps them in silt, not in sentences. To read them, we need different tools: diving, sonar, carbon dating, stratigraphy, and patience. In the quiet archive, we imagine a diver descending, not for treasure, but for context. A wall, a pottery shard, a stone anchor. Each object is a word in a separate language. Now, the Minoan connection also invites another thought. Plato describes Atlantis as technologically impressive. Modern Atlantis enthusiasts often inflate this into lasers and crystals and aircraft. But Plato does not say that. He describes canals, walls, ships, and metallurgy. These are impressive, yes, but they are within the realm of human capacity. A Bronze Age society could build harbors. A Bronze Age society could build complex palaces. A Bronze Age society could control trade routes. A Bronze Age society could appear to later Greeks as extraordinarily advanced, because advancement is relative. When you stand on a later hillside, looking back at older ruins, you can project greatness into them, because a ruined wall becomes a legend, because a collapsed roof becomes a moral lesson. We have all done this. We look at an abandoned factory and we imagine the lives inside. We look at a sunken ship and we imagine the night it went down. So, could Atlantis be a braided memory, part Thera, part Minoan, part older flood myths, part Plato's own political anxieties, all woven into a single tapestry? In the archive, this is plausible, not provable, but plausible. However, we must also be honest about what archaeology has and has not found. We have not found a city matching Plato's concentric design. We have not found inscriptions saying, "Here lies Atlantis." We have not found a drowned Acropolis with a Poseidon temple in the shape described. The Mediterranean hypothesis does not give us Atlantis as a place with a name. It gives us Atlantis as a story that could have been inspired by real disaster. And sometimes that is the best a story can offer. A resonance, a shadow, a true shape behind a fictional mask. Still, the search continues, because people want a location. They want coordinates. They want a point to pin to the map. So in the next chapter, we will leave the Aegean and step toward the wide Atlantic, toward the deeper and more dangerous claims. To expand the documentary record of Thera, we can linger on what exactly is known. Archaeologists have excavated the site of Critias on Santorini, a Bronze Age town buried in volcanic deposits. It preserves multi-story buildings, streets, and wall paintings. The preservation is often compared to Pompeii, not because the two events are identical, but because ash can seal a moment. Critias shows that complex settlement existed on the island prior to the eruption. It also shows that Aegean people lived with a volcanic landscape, building and rebuilding. The eruption itself is dated by multiple lines of evidence: ice cores that record atmospheric changes, radiocarbon measurements, and regional stratigraphy. The exact year is debated within a range, but the broad placement in the mid-2nd millennium BCE is stable. This is the kind of event that would have been felt across the Aegean. Ash layers can be traced, pumice can be identified. Tsunami deposits have been proposed in coastal contexts. When modern documentaries show a wave racing toward a harbour, they are dramatizing a real physical possibility. But then we must look at the Minoans with care. The popular Atlantis equation Minoans equals Atlantis often assumes the Minoans disappeared overnight. They did not. Cultures rarely vanish in a single evening. The Minoan world changed through a series of pressures: natural disaster, economic disruption, political shifts, and eventually the rise of Mycenaean influence on Crete. The eruption could have been one shock among several. The story becomes slower, less cinematic, and more realistic. This is where Plato's One Day and One Night functions as literature. It compresses, it concentrates, it gives the mind a single image. Real collapse can be long and uneven, with survivors adapting and rebuilding. But myths and moral tales prefer a clean cut, before and after. The Mediterranean hypothesis also has relatives beyond Thera. Some have pointed to the island of Crete itself, or to coastal settlements around it, as possible sources of memory. Others have looked to Cyprus, to the Levant, to Anatolia, and to the broader story of late Bronze Age instability. There were earthquakes, there were droughts, there were migrations, there were wars. The entire region experienced episodes that could feed a narrative of a great power humbled. There is also a different, quieter possibility that Plato uses a composite of Mediterranean realities to create a plausible antagonist. He may not be encoding one event, but rather building a city out of known ingredients. An island power like Crete, a wealthy plain like those near major river mouths, a naval empire like the ones Athens itself attempted to become. The Atlantis of the dialogues then becomes a mirror, not of one lost island, but of a general political pattern. And if that is the case, the Mediterranean hypothesis remains useful even when it does not locate Atlantis. It ties the legend to a region where we can test ideas against real layers of ash and stone. It keeps the story near the ground, near the sea, near the kinds of events humans actually endure. Chapter 4. The Atlantic and the Atlas of Desire, beyond the Pillars of Heracles. The phrase has a sound like a gate opening, a threshold, a line where the familiar world ends. For ancient Mediterranean sailors, the Atlantic was not the calm blue bowl of vacation brochures. It was a boundary, stronger currents, different tides, a coast that did not offer the same shelter, a horizon that could swallow you. So when Plato placed Atlantis there, he placed it in the psychological territory of the unknown. And this is where, many centuries later, Atlantis found a second life. In the modern era, as Europe mapped the world and built empires, the Atlantic became a stage for both discovery and projection. New continents were encountered, islands were charted, sea routes were opened, and the question quietly shifted from what is the moral of Plato's parable to where is the lost land, because the world now had empty spaces where it might fit. One of the most influential modern popularizers of Atlantis was Ignatius Donnelly, who in the 19th century argued that Atlantis was a real continent in the Atlantic Ocean, and that it was the source of civilization for both the old world and the new. His writing was energetic, confident, and in some ways it was a product of its time. A time when many thinkers, not always careful ones, wanted a single origin story for human achievements. A mother civilization, a central fountain from which pyramids, myths, and technologies could flow outward. The idea is seductive. It simplifies the messy, independent creativity of many cultures. It turns history into a family tree with one trunk. But archaeology has not supported this. Human civilization arose in multiple places. Agriculture developed independently. Cities emerged in different river valleys. and cultural similarities often come from trade and parallel invention, not from a lost supercontinent. Still, Donnelly's Atlantis became a seed. It fed later occult movements. It fed pseudo-archaeology. It fed fiction. And it fed the enduring belief that somewhere under the ocean there must be temples and roads and shining machines. In the archive, we can observe how the story changes when it enters the modern imagination. Plato's Atlantis is impressive but human. Modern Atlantis is often superhuman. It becomes a repository for every hope and fear about progress. If technology is exciting, Atlantis had more. If technology is frightening, Atlantis is the warning of what happens when it goes too far. Now, to speak softly but clearly, there are also ideological dangers here. The idea of a lost, advanced race has been used, in certain circles, to diminish real ancient peoples, to claim that indigenous monuments must have been built by outsiders, to deny the capacity of non-European cultures, to rewrite the past as a stage where the same imagined cast performs everywhere. This is not archaeology, it is appropriation. So, in our quiet archive, we keep a firm boundary. We can love mystery without discarding evidence. We can feel wonder without replacing human history with fantasy. Now, what does science say about the Atlantic itself? Could a continent have sunk in a day and night? Here the Earth speaks. Continents do not sink like ships. The crust is not a wooden deck. It moves, but it moves slowly, over millions of years. There are exceptions, like local subsidence, earthquakes, and volcanic collapses. Islands can partially sink. Coastal plains can drown with sea level rise. But a large landmass disappearing abruptly into the deep ocean is not consistent with plate tectonics as we understand it. Also, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge is known. The sea floor has been mapped. Not perfectly, but well enough to know there is no hidden continent-sized plateau matching the fantasy. However, there are submerged features, banks, plateaus, underwater volcanoes, and there is one famous region often mentioned, the Azores, a chain of islands above the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Some have suggested Atlantis was there, but again, the evidence does not show a drowned Bronze Age metropolis. The Azores are volcanic islands. They rise and fall. They can have landslides, but they do not preserve the kind of urban ruins that would settle the question. What about other places? Some have placed Atlantis near Spain, connecting it to the ancient city of Tartessos. Tartessos was real, a wealthy culture or trading center in the Iberian region. Some of its story is wrapped in myth. Some of its archaeology is debated, but it existed in a landscape shaped by rivers and marshes, a landscape that can flood. And here we get closer to something that feels like Plato's mud detail, a region where silt can choke waterways, where a tsunami could reshape a coastline. In 1755, the Lisbon earthquake created tsunamis that reached far. This is a modern example of how violent the Atlantic can be. If such an event struck an ancient coastal city, it could indeed vanish from the living world quickly, not by sinking into the abyss, but by being buried, destroyed, and abandoned. So perhaps Atlantis is not an island continent. Perhaps it is a coastal culture drowned by a combination of earthquake and flood. But then we must return to the text. The concentric rings, the imperial scale, the temple, the 9,000 years. It does not align neatly, and yet the search persists because the Atlantic is large enough to hold imagination. In the archive, we name this phenomenon an atlas of desire. When we want something to be true, we create maps that make space for it. When we want a lost origin, we place it in the sea where no one can easily verify. The ocean becomes a protective cover, a curtain, a place where absence is not disproof. And so, Atlantis thrives, not because of what we have found, but because of what we have not. Yet even here, the quiet archive insists on calm. We can admit what is unknown, we can honor the limits of evidence, and we can still explore. Because exploration is not only a hunt for confirmation, it is a way of learning about the world. To search for Atlantis is also to learn about earthquakes, about sea level change, about ancient trade networks, about how myths travel, and about how easily we can mistake desire for data. In the next chapter, we will listen to the scientists and archaeologists more closely. And we will also listen to the quieter voices, those of geology and time. A documentary chapter on the Atlantic also has to include a history of reading. Donnelly did not invent the hunger for a lost origin, but he framed it in a way that suited an industrial age, confident, comparative, and eager to connect monuments across oceans. His method was to collect similarities, pyramids here, pyramids there, and to treat similarity as proof of inheritance. Modern archaeology is more cautious. Similarity can arise from shared constraints. Stone stacked for height tends to become a pyramid-like form because that shape is stable. Writing systems can develop from administration. Monumental architecture can arise wherever elites have the resources to build. But Donnelly's narrative had another strength. It offered a dramatic explanation for why there are gaps in the record. If a mother civilization sank, then its absence explains the absence. The theory becomes self-protecting. The more evidence is missing, the more missing evidence is taken as evidence. This is a classic pattern in fringe claims, and the quiet archive notes it without anger. The pattern is human. Then there are the later currents: theosophy, occult revival, and spiritual movements that treated Atlantis as a source of hidden wisdom. In those accounts, the Atlantic is less a geographic region and more a spiritual coordinate. Atlantis becomes a classroom for souls, a place where knowledge was lost on purpose and must be recovered through intuition. For some listeners, that is meaningful as metaphor. For historians, it is a separate genre. The problem begins when metaphor is presented as geology. So, how do we speak about plate tectonics in the same soft tone we use for myth? We say, the ocean floor is younger than the continents, constantly created and recycled. The Atlantic basin has a structure that can be measured. There are ridges, fracture zones, seamounts, and sediment drifts. There are no signs of a recent, continent-sized landmass collapsing in the way popular Atlantis stories require. That does not remove mystery from the sea. It simply changes the kind of mystery, and the sea has plenty. There are submerged islands. There are volcanic flank collapses that can generate tsunamis. There are coastlines that have shifted dramatically since the last glacial maximum. If a coastal city on a low plain was struck by earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent subsidence, it could be lost fast enough to enter legend. This is where the Tartessos idea becomes interesting as an example of a more modest Atlantis. Not a planet-changing collapse, but a culturally important region whose memory is partially obscured by marshland and sediment. The Guadalquivir Delta and surrounding wetlands can bury. River mouths migrate. Storm surges and tsunamis can rework a coast. A place can vanish from common travel routes and survive only in stories. Even if Tartessos is not Atlantis, it demonstrates a mechanism by which real sites become semi-mythical. So the Atlantic chapter does not need an underwater continent to be meaningful. It needs only the recognition that the edge of the map is where humans place their longings. We place utopias there. We place monsters there. We place lost origins there. And then, when our ships finally cross the edge, the longing does not disappear. It relocates to the next blank space. Chapter 5. Sea level, stone, and the slow work of proof. There is a particular romance in the idea of a lost city under the sea. It suggests that history is not gone, only hidden, that the ocean has taken the streets but not erased them, that somewhere in blue silence pillars still stand. In the quiet archive, we do not mock that feeling. We understand it, because the sea does hide things, and it hides them well, but it also changes them. Wood rots, metal corrodes, stone tumbles, sand drifts, coral grows. Time does not preserve the way a museum does. Time preserves the way a river preserves, by moving, by grinding, by covering. So what does it mean to search for a sunken city in a scientific way? First, it means understanding the sea level story. At the end of the last ice age, vast amounts of water were locked in glaciers. As the climate warmed, ice melted, sea levels rose, coastlines moved. Areas that were once dry land became continental shelf. This is not speculation, it is measured. We can see it in coral terraces, in sediment cores, in submerged river channels, in the distribution of ancient shorelines. If you could travel back 12,000 years, you would see a different world. The Black Sea coastline would be different. The North Sea would include a landscape we now call Doggerland. Southeast Asia would have broader plains. Many human communities lived on coasts because coasts feed people. Fish, shellfish, salt, easy travel. When the sea rose, some settlements were lost. Not in a single night, necessarily, but in a lifetime. A slow retreat, a village moving uphill, a cemetery swallowed, a harbour abandoned. This is one way to interpret the Atlantis timescale. If Plato's 9,000 years were not a mistake, but a poetic distance, it would place the story in the era when sea levels were dramatically changing. Could there be cultural memories that long? It is difficult. Oral traditions can carry deep time elements, but they change. They encode, not replicate. Still, the possibility that ancient peoples remembered drowned lands is real. We have examples. In some indigenous Australian traditions, there are stories that appear to reflect coastal flooding thousands of years ago. In other regions, flood myths may preserve echoes of real events, but linking a specific narrative in Plato to a specific drowned coastline is not simple. Now we move from sea level to stone. Archaeology underwater is possible, but it is expensive, it is slow, it is dangerous, and it requires humility because the sea plays tricks. A natural rock formation can look like steps. A fracture can look like a wall. A line of stones can look like a road. Many alleged discoveries of Atlantis have turned out to be misinterpretations. Bimini Road, for example, is often cited, a line of stones near the Bahamas that some claim is a man-made road or harbour. Geologists generally interpret it as a natural formation of beach rock fractured along joints. It is a good case study, a compelling visual, a powerful story, and a reminder that pattern recognition is one of the strongest forces in the human mind. We are built to see meaning in shapes. Sometimes we see it correctly, sometimes we see it too early. So a careful search for Atlantis, if it is to exist at all, would need multiple converging lines of evidence. Not only stones that look arranged, but artifacts, pottery, tools, organic remains, radiocarbon dates, context layers, evidence of habitation, trade goods, inscriptions, if we are truly lucky, and above all, a coherent story that fits known human history. Because the ocean is not a separate planet. Any city under the sea would have been on land once. It would have had neighbors. It would have had trade. It would have left traces on land as well. Now, there is another approach that is quieter and sometimes more satisfying. Instead of demanding that Atlantis be found as a single city, we can treat it as a lens, a way to explore real lost cities. Because there are many. Some are not famous. Some were swallowed by desert. Some were covered by volcanic ash. Some were drowned by lakes created by dams. Some were lost to river shifts. The world is full of Atlantean moments. For example, the city of Helika in Greece was lost in an earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE. Ancient writers described it. For centuries, it was treated as legend, and then archaeologists found evidence of it under sediment. A real city, lost to the sea, recovered not by fantasy, but by method. Helika is not Atlantis, but it is a proof of concept. It shows that the ancient world did have sudden disasters that erased places. It shows that written accounts can preserve real events. And it shows that sometimes what seems mythical is simply unconfirmed, until it is confirmed. Another example, the ancient port structures off the coast of Alexandria, submerged statues, columns, evidence of subsidence and earthquake, a city edge that slipped into the water, not a continent, not a moral parable, but an urban reality. And there is Dwarka off the coast of India, where underwater structures have sparked debates. And there are submerged settlements in the Baltic, and there are lake-drowned villages in many countries. If you listen carefully, the earth is always rewriting the shoreline. Now, we should also speak about the psychology of proof. Many people want Atlantis to be found because finding it would feel like opening a locked room in history, a revelation, a validation, a treasure. But archaeology rarely gives revelations that neatly. It gives fragments, it gives probabilities, it gives careful language, it gives debates. A headline may shout, "Lost City Discovered," but the field notes whisper, "This feature is consistent with," "This sample suggests," "This layer may indicate." The archive respects the whisper, because whispers are how truth often enters. Now, in a quiet ASMR tone, we can also appreciate something else. Even if Atlantis never existed as a single place, the process of searching has created a map of human curiosity. It has pushed ocean exploration. It has inspired researchers to look at submerged landscapes. It has encouraged discussions of climate change and sea level rise. It has, at times, misled. But it has also motivated, and perhaps that is one of the hidden functions of legends. They create energy. They point attention. They make us look. So, as we move toward our final chapter, we will not try to force a conclusion. Instead, we will assemble the record. We will gather the strands: philosophy, geology, myth, and modern meaning, and we will place them gently into the archive drawer. To make this chapter truly documentary, we can describe the tools and workflows that underwater and coastal archaeologists use, because method is often the missing character in Atlantis conversations. A modern survey may begin with remote sensing, multi-beam sonar to map the seafloor, side-scan sonar to detect textures and anomalies, magnetometers to locate metal objects or disturb sediments, and sub-bottom profilers to see layers beneath the seabed. These are not treasure-hunting gadgets. They are measurement instruments. They turn the ocean into a readable surface. Then comes ground truthing, divers, remotely operated vehicles, and careful sampling. A sonar wall is only a hypothesis until it is seen. Even then, a seen wall is only a feature until it is placed in context. Is it shaped by human hands or by fracture and erosion? Are there associated ceramics? Are there tool marks? Is there a stratigraphic relationship showing that the feature belongs to a human occupation layer? Dating is another quiet discipline. Radiocarbon dating requires organic material: wood, bone, seeds, charcoal. In marine contexts, there are complications like the marine reservoir effect, which can make samples appear older. That means a serious claim includes calibration, discussion of uncertainty, and ideally multiple dates that agree. We can also mention that a city is not just buildings. A city has waste, food remains, broken objects, and layers of living. If a large settlement existed, it should leave a signature: ceramics in quantity, hearth residues, shells, animal bones, and repeated construction phases. A single neat line of stones may look impressive, but it is not a city unless the broader pattern is present. That is why many sensational Atlantis announcements fade. They rely on a single dramatic image, not on an assemblage of evidence. The documentary approach is to ask for the boring parts: the maps, the coordinates, the sampling strategy, the artifact catalogue, the peer review, and the alternative explanations. The examples of Helike and Alexandria are worth expanding because they show how real, lost places are recovered. Helike was described by ancient authors as punished, swallowed by the sea. For a long time, the site could not be located, and the story floated in the space between history and legend. The eventual discoveries did not come from one heroic diver finding a temple in clear water. They came from patient work in a landscape of silt and river deposits where the coastline had changed. The lesson is simple. Catastrophic loss often leaves confusing deposits. Finding a lost city is often an exercise in reading mud, and mud returns us to Plato's detail. If the sea beyond the pillars became difficult to navigate because of mud, that could reflect a real phenomenon: shallow banks, sediment plumes after a collapse, or marshy coastal shelves. The detail is not proof, but it is a reminder that the natural world can produce exactly the messy obstacles myths describe. So chapter 5 leaves us with a gentle discipline: to love the image of a sunken city, and at the same time to insist that images must be tested. Wonder is allowed, but wonder must share the room with method. And because Atlantis claims appear so often in modern media, the archive also keeps a small guide for listening. First, we listen for provenance. Where did the data come from? Was the site surveyed systematically, with recorded coordinates, instrument settings, and repeatable methods? Or was it found as a dramatic anecdote? A diver saw a pyramid in a storm with no controlled documentation. Second, we listen for context. A photograph of a block on the seafloor can be compelling, but a single block is not evidence of a civilization. Context means the broader pattern, associated artifacts, surrounding features, stratigraphy, and an explanation for how the feature came to be there. Third, we listen for dating. Claims about Atlantis often rush past this, but in archaeology, time is everything. If a structure is claimed to be from the end of the last ice age, we should ask what samples were dated and how. If a claim avoids dates entirely, or uses dates pulled from unrelated contexts, the claim is not yet anchored. Fourth, we listen for alternative explanations. Serious researchers try to disprove themselves. They ask, could this be beach rock? Could this be jointed limestone? Could this be a landslide deposit? Could currents have arranged these stones? The sea can create regular-looking patterns. The archive does not treat skepticism as hostility. It treats skepticism as a tool. Fifth, we listen for peer conversation. No single person owns the past. The most reliable conclusions emerge when multiple teams, using different methods, can examine the same evidence. Peer review is not perfect, and it can be slow, but it is a filter against the most obvious errors. This guide does not remove romance from the sea. It simply prevents the romance from hardening into certainty too quickly. There is also a quiet, ethical dimension. Underwater cultural heritage is fragile. A popular claim can attract looting, souvenir collecting, and damage. The archive notes that responsible exploration includes permits, conservation planning, and respect for local laws and communities. The point is not to possess the past, but to understand it. Finally, we keep in mind that Atlantis is not a single question, but a cluster of questions that are often tangled together. Did a large landmass sink is one question. Did coastal settlements drown is another. Did Plato draw from real disasters is another. Why does the story persist is another. When these are separated, the conversation becomes clearer. When they are blended, the conversation becomes a fog where every answer seems possible. So, as we turn the page from chapter 5 to chapter 6, we do so with a calmer posture. The sea may contain ruins, and the earth certainly contains catastrophes. But proof is slow, and the most faithful way to honor the past is to meet it with patience. Chapter 6. What remains when a city is not found? In a quiet room, late at night, the mind can become an ocean. Thoughts drift, memories rise, images appear. A ringed city, sudden wave, a temple catching the last light. Atlantis has lived in that ocean of the mind for more than 2,000 years. That alone is remarkable. Empires rose and fell. Languages changed. Libraries burned. And still the name remained. So what remains if the city is not found? First, the text remains. Plato's dialogues, preserved and copied. The careful frame. The unfinished Critias. The voice that says, listen. This is a true account. Even if we doubt that claim, we cannot erase its effect. Second, the lesson remains. A society that becomes rich and powerful can lose its balance. It can mistake expansion for destiny. It can forget restraint. And then, when the world shakes, it is vulnerable. This moral is not unique to Atlantis, but Atlantis carries it with unusual beauty. A city of rings. A city that sinks. A city that becomes sea. Third, the world remains. Because to chase Atlantis is to learn the real Earth, the tectonic plates, the volcanic arcs, the silted deltas, the memory of tsunamis, the slow rising of sea level, the landscape that was once land, the landscape that will be land again in some distant shift. In that sense, Atlantis is a gateway drug to geology, a myth that leads to maps, a bedtime story that leads to bathymetry. Fourth, the warning remains, and it changes with time. In Plato's era, it warned against hubris. In later centuries, it warned against moral decay. In the 19th century, it was used to argue for a single origin of civilization. In the 20th and 21st, it became a symbol of lost technology, lost wisdom, or lost paradise. In our era, it also becomes a whisper about climate. Sea levels can rise, coasts can be lost, cities can flood, people can become refugees from water. Atlantis turns from ancient caution to modern mirror. And finally, the longing remains. There is a tenderness in the desire to believe that something beautiful has been preserved underwater, that there is a secret museum beneath the waves. That time, which usually destroys, sometimes only hides. This longing is not foolish. It is human. We all have inner Atlantean cities, places we remember but cannot return to. A childhood home, a voice on an old answering machine, a friendship that drifted away, a neighborhood that was rebuilt. The myth gives a shape to loss, and it gives permission to mourn what was never fully ours. Now, as we close the archive drawer, we can also place one more note inside. Atlantis is not only a question of existence, it is a question of method. How do we know what we know? How do we weigh texts? How do we interpret symbols? How do we test claims? How do we resist the pull of desire? How do we stay curious without becoming careless? In the quiet archive, the answer is slow. We read, we cross-check, we look for context, we accept uncertainty. We do not confuse a beautiful image with a verified sight. We do not confuse a passionate claim with evidence. But we also do not dismiss wonder, because wonder is the beginning of attention, and attention is the beginning of learning. So, if you are listening tonight, perhaps you do not need Atlantis to be found. Perhaps you only need to let the mind drift across its rings, across the bright canals, across the sudden night of water, and feel in the distance the steady rhythm of the real sea, a sea that keeps secrets, a sea that also keeps records, a sea that covers and uncovers, a sea that reminds us that the world is older than our certainty. We place the final page back into its sleeve. We smooth the edges. We turn off the reading lamp, and we let the archive become dark and quiet again. To end this documentary in the archive voice, we can add a final, careful inventory, not of treasures, but of categories. Atlantis, as preserved in our record, occupies several shelves at once. On one shelf is ancient philosophy, a writer using narrative to test political ideals, to stage a conflict between restraint and excess, and to ask what kind of city deserves to endure. On another shelf is reception history, later readers, translators, and mapmakers who carried the story forward. Each era relabeled the folder. Some wrote allegory on the spine, some wrote history, some wrote prophecy, some wrote hidden science. On another shelf is earth science, the undeniable fact that shorelines move, that volcanoes explode, that earthquakes break cities, that deltas bury ports, and that the sea can take a settlement and leave only a rumor. This shelf is heavy with cores, dates, maps, and the slow language of probability. And on another shelf is the human need for a lost place, a place that embodies both splendor and warning, a place that lets us say, without naming ourselves, that we fear collapse, and that we hope for a trace of what was. When we say what remains when a city is not found, we are also admitting that many cities are not found until we learn how to look. The history of archaeology is full of reversals. Troy was debated, Helike was doubted. The past is often larger than the confidence of any one era. That does not mean every legend is a map. It means only that humility is wise. So we hold two thoughts at once. The first, there is no confirmed archaeological site that matches Plato's Atlantis as described. and the strongest scientific models do not allow a continent to drop overnight into the Atlantic abyss. The second, the real world, contains enough sudden loss to keep the legend emotionally true, even if the literal city remains unverified. This is the quiet value of the Atlantis folder. It teaches us to live with partial evidence. It teaches us to separate the beauty of a story from the certainty of a claim. It teaches us to ask better questions. Not only where, but why. Not only did it happen, but what work is this story doing? We close the drawer gently. We do not slam it. We leave room for new finds, for new maps, for new readings, and for the patient possibility that the sea will someday give up a corner of its record. One more note, filed under modern echoes. Atlantis has become a shared reference point, a kind of cultural shorthand. In novels, it becomes a stage for adventure. In films, it becomes a visual spectacle of glowing domes and falling towers. In games, it becomes a level, an underwater labyrinth to explore. These retellings are not evidence, but they are a record of fascination. They show which parts of the ancient description are most magnetic. The rings, the suddenness, the sense of a hidden archive underwater. In academic life, Atlantis tends to sit in an awkward place. Classicists analyze the dialogues as literature and philosophy. Archaeologists focus on material evidence and rarely treat Atlantis as a target site. Geologists explain why the dramatic sinking of a large landmass is implausible. Yet the name keeps returning to public conversation because it speaks in a language people already know, the language of loss. So the archive keeps both registers without forcing them to fight. The scholarly register asks, what did Plato intend? How did later readers interpret him? And what does the geological record allow? The cultural register asks, why do we keep imagining a city that is both beautiful and doomed? And what does that reveal about our own era? When these registers are kept separate, Atlantis becomes less of an argument and more of a study in how humans weave meaning from danger. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,